Welcome to the American Research Center in Egypt's fourth episode in our series, A History of Egyptology. This series explores the West's nearly 2,000-year fascination with ancient Egypt. Its goal is to highlight how ancient Egypt has impacted different peoples throughout the ages and how it continues to do so. Our story thus far has explored aspects of Western interest in Egypt from the time of the ancient Greeks up to the 19th century. This episode continues the story with a shift in focus from Europe to the United States. The increased access to Egypt and the flurry of research into its ancient past, mentioned in the last episode, only fueled further Western interest in the land of the Nile's history. Exploration into Egypt's ancient civilization was viewed as an exploration into the origins of human society itself. Given both this motivation and the allure that ancient Egypt radiated, it's no surprise to find the citizens of a relatively new society interested in its past. Americans could be found in Egypt as far back as the late 1700s. Both John Antis, a Christian missionary, and John Ledyard, the intrepid world explorer, could be found in Cairo at this time. One of the first American expatriates to settle in Egypt was the sea captain Francis Barthou. He made the country his home in the early 1800s, led expeditions up the Nile, and traded in antiquities. He even helped Henry Salt, the British consul general in Egypt, build some of his collection. Americans could also be found at the forefront of the military and exploration efforts. The retired U.S. naval officer George Bethune English, for example, was commander of artillery in the Egyptian army during its 1820 invasion of Sudan. He traveled with two other Americans and a host of foreigners into the largely unknown land south of Egypt. During this trip, which led to the first survey of ancient Sudanese monuments, he kept notes of all that he saw. He published his observations, which included those on ancient Egyptian ruins that were only poorly understood at that time, upon his return. American tourists were also found visiting the land of the Nile through the 1800s. Perhaps the most famous was the Civil War hero and former American President Ulysses S. Grant, who toured the country in 1877. By the end of the century, important archaeological work was also being conducted in Egypt by Americans. The wealthy benefactor, Theodore Davis, for example, spent a good portion of his fortune exploring the Valley of the Kings. By the end of his time there, he had helped to find and explore about 30 tombs. Some of the more famous tombs include that of Pharaoh Thutmose IV, the famous female King Hatshepsut, the tomb of Yuya and Tuya, and the tomb of Pharaoh Horemheb. Americans were part and parcel of the scientific and exploratory developments mentioned in our last episode, episode 3. They were also part of the larger community that witnessed the discovery of a cache of royal mummies near the famed temple of Hatshepsut in Luxor in 1881. This cache proved to be the very first find of ancient Egyptian royalty. Similarly, Americans took note of the work of scholars such as William Matthew Flinders Petrie, who helped to create an understanding of the ancient people who lived in Egypt immediately before the time of the pharaohs. They also took note of developments in the study of the language of ancient Egypt, such as Gaston Maspero's publication of the pyramid texts in 1894. Along with the professionalization of Egyptology in the late 1800s, institutions devoted to the study and preservation of ancient Egypt's cultural heritage came into being. The British Egypt Exploration Fund, now known as the Egypt Exploration Society, was founded in 1882 by the famous author Amelia Edwards. Through its efforts, a number of antiquities were excavated, purchased, and then brought both to Great Britain and the United States, fueling an interest in and passion for ancient Egypt in both of these countries. Egypt's own Antiquities Service came into being in the 1850s. Directed by the influential French scholar Auguste Mariette, this service was established to control the excavation and movement of Egyptian antiquities. It continues to regulate the work undertaken by foreign missions in Egypt today. With such a long tradition of interaction with ancient Egypt, it's no surprise to find that Western interest in ancient Egypt only continued to expand in the 20th century. Our next episode will continue the story into the 1900s with a special focus on the birth of the American Research Center in Egypt and the U.S.'s fascination with all things ancient Egyptian.